Welcome, welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining the webinar. I'm just going to wait a few more seconds to allow any last attendees to enter the room before we get started. Welcome to everybody to our discussion for the day, The Rise of the Tech Oligarchy, Power, Wealth, and the Future of Democracy. This discussion is hosted by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School and by the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. My name is Danielle Allen. I'm the James Bryant Conant University Professor here at Harvard and Director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation. Before we dive in, I'd like to share a few quick announcements. First, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Second, today's discussion is being recorded. A link to the recording will be sent to you by email following the event, and it will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. There will be time for questions from the audience toward the end of the conversation. You can submit your questions at any time throughout the discussion using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This is an incredibly important conversation to have today. The occasion for the conversation is a new paper by Professor Cohen. I'll introduce Professor Cohen in a moment. The paper is called Oligarchy, State, and Cryptopia, and we'll put a link to it in the chat. It does a brilliant job of providing rigorous definitions of oligarchy and comprehensive accounts of the current landscape and historical development of the kind of wealth-based political oligarchy we are watching achieve serious dominance in our world today. There are lots of good questions already that have come in from all of you. And we will want to talk not just about the map of the current moment, but also try to think our way to solutions. But I want to acknowledge that the challenges facing us right now really are considerable. But it is thanks to papers like Professor Cohen's and the work of people like Professor Farrell that make it possible for us to think our way through the problem and start to see openings of possibility and opportunities for agency. So with that, let me introduce our two guests. Julie Cohen is the Mark Claster Mamelin Professor of Law and Technology at Georgetown. She teaches and writes about surveillance, privacy and data protection, intellectual property, and the ways information technologies are reshaping legal institutions. She's the author of Between Truth and Power, The Legal Constructions of Informational Capitalism, and Configuring the Network Self, Law, Code, and the Play of Everyday Practice, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. She's also the co-author of a casebook, Copyright and Global Information Economy, and faculty co-director of Georgetown's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, and an advisor to the Center on Privacy and Technology. Henry Farrell is the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora Institute Professor of International Affairs at the School of Advanced International Studies. He is the recipient of the 2019 Friedrich Schiedel Prize for Politics and Technology. His work spans democracy, the politics of the internet, and international political economy. Henry is the author of Privacy and Power, The Transatlantic Fight Over Freedom and Security, and also The Political Economy of Trust, Interests, Institutions, and Interfirm Cooperation. He previously served as a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. So with that, I'm delighted to have you both here. I'm going to turn it over to Julie for 5 minutes of remarks, followed by 5 minutes of remarks from Henry, and then I'll pose a few questions to get the conversation going. And then we will open the conversation up to the audience. So again, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Danielle. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. So the project that Danielle spoke of and the paper that's in the link, it was motivated by a worry that that people who have been pondering the question of how to make giant tech platforms governable were maybe missing a couple important pieces of the puzzle. And that worry has grown only more acute as we've seen the other developments in our political space in the last year. The large tech companies that exercise so much power are very unusual not only because they are so big, right, and not only because they have attained infrastructural kind of power, right? So they have tendrils into all of the different functions and arenas of our lives and our economy and our governance. But they're also unusual from kind of a financial and legal perspective, right? So they with a couple exceptions, right? So notably, Microsoft and NVIDIA are not structured in this way. When they transitioned from being venture funded startups to being to going public, right, to becoming ostensibly public companies subject to the strictures of public corporate governance and to shareholder voting and boards of directors and all that good stuff that we think about. In fact, they took advantage of a structure that reserved more than 50% voting control to their founding innovators. So, in other words, although normally one thinks of going public as trading scale and capital for increased accountability, these companies and their household names, right? The Googles and the Apples and the X's, and X, of course, as you know, went back private, but they didn't have to make that bargain, right? And so they grew very, very large, right? And many other startups that failed, I should say, also have chosen that structure, right? They grew very, very large and in a way that that did nothing to temper or constrain the enormous personal power of their founding innovators slash oligarchs. And that is a fact worth paying attention to, right? There are stories that we tell in law and in political science and in economics about the behavior of capital and capitalists, but oligarchs are different, right? And I can't claim, by the way, I have to give a shout out to Professor Jeffrey Winters at Northwestern, who literally wrote the book titled Oligarchy. But their power derives from extreme concentrations of material wealth that they pretty much solely control and that they leverage and deploy to obtain and build their own personal advantage. And one thing that I do in the paper is really trace the ways in which that is very centrally accountable for a lot of these puzzles around why the big tech companies are so ungovernable. Um, I think maybe, and so I guess I want to stop there because I was asked only to speak for a few very brief minutes. But the point I want to underline is that a particular set of legal and financial arrangements is very centrally implicated in why they became so big and at the same time so powerful and so unconstrained. Um, and that's a worry now because it is joined up, and I'm sure we'll get to this in the discussion, with an ideology that they all seem to share and an interest that they seem to share in wielding that size and wielding that power to reinvent the state in the image of what they would prefer to see. Which is smaller, sort of inhabited and hollowed out and repopulated by the algorithms and operations that they have developed, and pretty much devoted to doing their bidding. Henry, over to you.
Okay, well, that turns out to be a fantastic segue because, unlike Julie, I don't actually have a paper. Instead, I'm pulling from a variety of different, more or less popular pieces that I've written over the last couple of months, as all of us have tried to come to grips with this transformation that is happening. So when I think about these oligarchs, I think that the ideology is really important here. That's the first thing that I would stress. And here, it's complicated. There's a lot going on. There's a very interesting book by Adam Becker, which came out last week called More Everything Forever, which really gets at some of these things very well, I think. But if I think about what the fundamental assumptions that are shared are, first of all, there's a very strong libertarian emphasis on exit that is on the ability of these of individuals or businesses which are in some way special to exit from the system of rules that are constraining them and to be able to engage in unbridled entrepreneurial creativity. And sort of that is the story that Mark Andreessen and people like to tell. This also tends very much towards neo-reactionary theories of politics, in which we would be much better off without government and instead with these kinds of cameralist ideas, where effectively we will be governed by the equivalent of Silicon Valley startups and able to move back and forward from one to another. This goes together very clearly with a great man theory, and the gender specificity, I think, is intentional here. If you read this so-called Silicon Valley canon of key books that people like Patrick Collison have identified as being the sort of the books that people in Silicon Valley read, they are mostly about dudes and sort of figuring out how to reshape society in the shape of enormous opposition, and how wonderful and how heroic this is. And this ties in, I think, to a kind of an engineering and optimizing mindset. This is, in some ways, the opposite of the kind of the James Scott thing. James Scott talks about the value of local knowledge and is all against the idea that you have, so that you try to create these big structures of knowledge, these big structures of assumption. He talks about the ways in which they can go horribly wrong. In some ways, Silicon Valley, I think, has taken this on and has taken it on as a kind of a torment nexus kind of thing. This is a joke, I guess, from Twitter, as being a kind of here is a business plan for actually the way in which we ought to reshape government. We ought to optimize everything. We ought to have everything running on algorithms, and this is going to be so much better. This ties in with a business model, which is really, as important or perhaps even more important than the ideological questions. If you read Reid Hoffman and Ye's blitzscaling, the lightning fast path to building massively valuable companies, you'll get a sense of how this works. It is all about scale. It is trying to build up to scale as quickly and as effectively as possible. The way to build up scale is to use algorithms and data, because you can scale these up much more easily than ordinary processes with human beings, who are grumpy, who want to have rights, who want to be consulted. All of these things look to be problematic if you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur. This also explains why there is a marked hostility to labor rights. You don't worry about mistakes. Mistakes are something that more or less go with the territory, and that is just sort of part of the deal that you have to deal with. You have small teams to try and reform big organizations, and you try to move extremely quickly on a whole variety of fronts in order to get stuff done before your opponents can respond. So this, I think, if we want to look at Doge, this really gives us a description, a very practical description of many of the strategies that Doge has adopted, and the ideology gives you a sense of what are the values, what are the ideals that are driving this. This has worked out pretty badly. Also, I don't want to say that Reid Hoffman is the greatest villain of history. He has denounced some of these things, but equally, this is what we're seeing with Doge is an effort, I think, to apply Silicon Valley oligarchical values and Silicon Valley oligarchical techniques to really remake government. They have identified a whole bunch of vulnerabilities, what my colleague Bruce Schneier would identify as an attack surface. So that there are all of these technical systems within government, for example, data structures which can be turned to unintended purposes. They have identified, that they are a threat model. They are a particular kind of threat. They have identified ways in which it is really very easy, if you are an insider and if you adopt these techniques, to do things very quickly. And there are very, very few people who can stop you in the shorter term. If Congress was not dominated by allies of President Trump, of course, it would be different. But as it is, we have to turn to the law courts, and law courts, of course, are very, very slow, are often hesitant to challenge the government. And by the time that they react, much of the damage has been done. So I do think the final thing that's worth saying is that we seem to be moving to something which is not actually the old Silicon Valley oligarchical approach. We seem to be moving to something which has some weird Russian characteristics. That is, if you look at Russian business back in the day, immediately after the Soviet Union, if you were a Russian business, you needed to have a quote roof, unquote. In other words, you needed to have a protector, which was either a member of the government or a member of some criminal organization. It was very often hard to distinguish between the two. That is the world in which we seem to be moving towards, and sort of if you are one of these oligarchs. And it is really interesting, for example, to look look at the photograph of all of them together in Saudi Arabia a couple of days ago, trying to figure out more or less who divides the spoils from having hyperscalers and from having these huge AI facilities being built in the Gulf. There is a lot of money sloshing around. If you want to get access to that money, you want to be linked to the government. If you don't want to be attacked or to be undermined using a variety of quasi-legal tactics, you want to have your government protector. And this really is something that we seem to be moving towards, which is a different configuration of the relationship between tech oligarchs and the state than I think we have had in the past. And that's all I have to say.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start by sort of digging into some of these concepts, and then about halfway through, I'll pivot to the question of what to do. And as I said, I'll blend some questions from myself and then some from the audience as well. Julie, if I could start with you, I would love to actually just ask you to go back to the work you do, offering a very precise definition of oligarchy. You do draw on Winter's book, as you say, but at the end of the day, what you're doing is giving us sort of real clarity about the definition of tech oligarchs as a distinct category of oligarchs. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on that definitional work, so that people are sort of crystal clear about what you are calling out when you are identifying this as a new category of oligarchy.
Sure. So the So the book picks up on an idea that Winters offers and then expands upon it. And the idea is that you can, across like millennia, one can map oligarchs sort of in a conceptual space based on the nature of their relationships to each other and to government institutions, and whether their MO involves using force directly or whether they're content to kind of let the state exercise force as long as the state has institutions that they can use to protect their own wealth and property. And one insight from that approach is that things change, right? So places in the world other than here, right? That's been true. The way that oligarchs were in Russia after the wall came down, but before the rise of Putin was different than they are now. Things changed, when Suharto was in power in Indonesia, and then later things changed in the Philippines. Here, things have very definitely been changing. Tech oligarchs avail themselves of the trappings of a civil government, right? They do pay taxes, even though one could wish many things about the structure of the tax system, right? They do convene their boards of directors. They do show up to testify in Congress. Yet in other ways, they don't have standing personal armies of their own, although maybe Elon Musk has sort of been putting one together. It's a little unclear. But they rule their spaces, right? The Facebook, Instagram, metaverse space, the Amazon space, the X space. They rule their spaces like petty despots, and within those spaces, they sometimes behave like they care about governing institutions. So we get the Facebook Oversight Board, right? They sometimes behave like they care about content moderation, for example, but sometimes they behave like petty tyrants who just do whatever they want and dictate their very large enterprises to behave in whatever ways they want. And that, combined with the global scale of their power and the way it sort of is underneath, right, all of these different activities, like a highway system or a water grid or electrical grid, it's infrastructural, excuse me, gives them a reach that is sort of laterally and vertically and horizontally very, very distinct from that which any other group of oligarchs has previously exercised. And they do all seem to know one another, right? And sometimes they work in concert and sometimes they try to kneecap each other. But in respect of what they seem to want to do to the state, they seem pretty cohesive. You're muted.
Sorry about that, not good for a moderator. On that point about global reach, can you also please just extend a little bit on that in the sense that I think everybody is very aware of the sense in which the platforms themselves have global reach, they have, global user base and the like, but you mean the global reach in more than one way. You're not just talking about the fact that the infrastructure is in everybody's lives. You're also talking about oligarchs coming from different original nation states, but sort of forming a kind of community of global oligarchs. Can you say a little bit more about the
Yeah.
economics of that?
So there's and I want to shout out somebody else too. So there's a sociologist at Dartmouth named Brooke Harrington who's done wonderful work on the global wealth management industry, including I think embedding herself and getting training as an aspiring wealth manager. There is there is an entire sort of stratum on which those with kind of oligarch level resources exist. And it is one where they are repeatedly brought into contact with one another and have no regular need of being brought regularly into contact with anyone else or anyone ordinary, right? And so whether it's it's a Putin style subservient oligarch in that system, or someone coming from the Middle East, or someone coming from, out of one of the sovereign wealth funds in the Asia Pacific area, they are being brought into contact with one another through shared commonality of interest and shared participation in these sort of wealth management projects. Venture capital in the U.S. is very much it draws it draws investments, not just from the big U.S. pension companies, although pension investors, though it does do that as well, but it draws oligarchs from all over the world to invest here because our venture space here is so very lightly regulated and the returns that it can offer are so very large. So increasingly, there's a way in which there's the nice, happy, shiny story that we've been telling each other for a century about the public companies and the public stock markets and people's pensions and all of that. And then there's the places where the really big money comes together. And that is increasingly in the service of projects designed and funded by oligarchs in tech and in finance as well, I should say.
Great, thank you. And to both of you, just a little bit more characterization here. Where does cryptocurrency fit in to this picture story? And how?
You want to go first?
Yikes. Okay, it fits in a lot of ways, I guess is what I would say. I would think about this, first it fits as a kind of a business model. If you look, for example, at Andreessen Horowitz and other people 3 or 4 years ago, they were trying to brief everybody on how these DAOs, these distributed autonomous organizations, were going to be the future of everything. That you would have these in sort of forms of blockchain organized and sort of rulemaking, which would really be able to do a multitude of things. This, of course, didn't produce some quite interesting governance experiments. It did not produce very much in the way of actual whatever. So part of, I think, what we have seen, for example, with the Trump administration, is Andreessen Horowitz and other people who were worried about their crypto investments really came together in a quite unprecedented way in order to try and make sure that the next government, and indeed that democratic legislators too, would be as crypto friendly as possible. So they took out Katie Porter in California, or at least they sort of claimed they had taken out by putting large amounts of money into a campaign opposing her. They put $40 million, according to the New York Times, into the Ohio campaign in order to help Sherrod Brown lose. And we're now about to see the so-called Genius Act, which would effectively bring in stable coins, a particular kind of cryptocurrency, into the mainstream financial system of the United States. And I think here, so this ties in some interesting ways to the kinds of work that Brooke Harrington and other people have been doing. In addition to the book which Julie mentioned, Harrington has done a lot of work looking at the extremely sketchy offshore finance industry, a lot of extremely sketchy arrangements. This is something which the crypto ecology has really made much, much easier. If you look at Binance, if you look in particular at Tether, which is a stable coin which is widely used, according to Wall Street Journal and other places, for transferring illicit proceeds of one sort or another, these are becoming increasingly regularized as a part of the financial system, and also as means through which you see exchange happening between politicians and sort of businesses, and indeed foreign governments and foreign funds which are looking to try and influence the United States. So that most recently there's a stable coin called USD1, which is associated with the Trump family, which was used by the Abu Dhabi Investment Fund to transfer a quite extraordinary amount of money through to Binance, which has been effectively has pleaded guilty to money laundering in a settlement with the Department of Justice under the Biden administration. And this was structured in a way which, according to the New York Times, would potentially allow for hundreds of millions of dollars to go to to people who are associated with Trump. So I don't know whether those figures actually, those figures, I didn't see where the New York Times got them from, but that is what is being reported. And what is certainly true is that in a world in which crypto becomes integrated into the financial system of the United States, it becomes much, much easier to enable a whole bunch of shady seeming political and economic arrangements. And that is the world that we may be heading into.
So can I jump in now? Yeah. So there is a really interesting ambivalence in the oligarchic relationship to the state, and crypto plays right into kind of both sides of it. So there's kind of the shiny, happy libertarian crypto story that it's about decentralizing financial institutions and decentralizing state control of finance. So that's kind of nominally what, for example, the idea of opening stablecoins up to issuers that are not banks purports to be about. But oligarchs are parasitic on the state wherever they are, or sometimes they make themselves into the state. And a really core aspect of these stories is just straight up grift, right? So if you cast your mind back to the time around the inauguration when all of a sudden, right, they dropped the Trump meme coin, and it went up to stratospheric levels. And then all of a sudden, 2 days after that, or whatever, right, they dropped the Melania meme coin, and the Trump meme coin plunged as the Melania meme coin rose, right? The essence of the crypto grift, if you're an oligarch that plays in this space, is you get in first, right? And you get out high, right? And the suckers come later, right? And the other key thing to understand about crypto as grift, and it undermines this shiny, happy decentralization story, is to make it work, you need an entire kind of apparatus of middlemen, right? You need wallets and dashboards and everything to make it possible to bring the suckers in. The suckers can't remember their passwords, right? And they need wallets, and they need an exchange, and they need to take and the oligarchs too need to take the money out in the fiat currency of their preference, because that's how they maintain their wealth. And every time that is happening, they're taking a cut. And so I'm in DC, right? I talk to regulators, and there are regulators who will say, crypto, it's not real. You're investing in something that's not real. It's tulips, it's a fad. And that is just so very much not the point, right? The point is the grift, right? And the point is to hollow out and restructure the institutions of finance so that the oligarchs are kind of taking their cut every step of the way. And there is a price to be paid for that, which is the loss of a window into the financial system and the loss of the capacity to kind of govern in the interest of systemic stability, for example. And just if you don't like corruption and grift, which I think we should not.
Right. No, no, we should not. We should not like corruption or grift. Great. Thank you. So now you've done a beautiful job, both of you, of kind of characterizing the structure of the oligarchy, their behavior, underlying ideologies, and the way in which what they're doing is capturing and restructuring the state, hollowing it out in many dimensions, but also transforming it to support, Julie, in your words, both wealth offense and wealth defense. So that there's a kind of cycle for them of constant increase of both wealth and power. And the political and the economic are totally entangled. In addition, Julie, in your paper, you make the point that not only are they restructuring the state in the present for the purpose of this wealth and political nexus in its application, but that they're also have taken unto themselves basically the sort of right, privilege, sort of province of defining, you put it, defining a human future, casting out into the future for all of humanity and sort of dragging the globe in the direction of their envisioning. And you talk about three, more than this, but you, among other things, you talk about space, the importance of space travel, Mars, et cetera. You talk about transcendence, and you talk about transhumanism. And I think these are really important concepts that people need to have awareness of. So I would love it if you could just share a little bit about what precisely is this future vision for humanity that they are actually proactively working towards. So again, it's like it's not just about the here and now, it's not just about the state, but it's about, a kind of crazy vision for where humanity should be dragged.
So, okay, so the vision is just to transcend everything that you know, those policy nerds and distasteful activists and global governance people have told us is scarce or is a bummer, right? So we're going to transcend the limits of the human genome, right, by simply re-engineering it. We are going to transcend the limits of human intelligence by basically brute forcing excuse me, AGI, not GAI, brute forcing artificial general intelligence by training it with all of our behavioral data until, hey, presto, it achieves human, or as they prefer to think about it, superhuman levels. And we're going to transcend the fact that this is all going to torch the planet, because we're going to transcend the planet, right? And we're going to build, depending on whether you're Team Musk or Team Bezos, either cities on Mars or giant rotating cylindrical space stations in space. And if I could see the faces of the people in the Q&A, usually at this point, they get this look like, what did you smoke before the webinar? But it's all kind of written there, right? And the idea is that this is, I mean, I think that the more of everything book that Henry cited, the ultimate point of that author is the way these people think is literally, we're really smart and really rich, so of course we can make this happen. How dare you tell us we can't? But in order to do it, the naysayers kind of have to be sort of swept aside or colonized from the inside out, right? Universities, the place from which the innovation used to come, have been kind of repositioned as the enemy. And at least one tech oligarch, Peter Thiel, just thinks he's going to build his own, right? The media, right, and all of the sort of institutions of sort of knowledge curation and validation and public discourse are sort of being taken over by generative AI bots. Um, and and with the sort of hollowing out of government by Doge, we can look forward to that happening to all the institutions of government as well. It's not that they want to make government disappear, and this is also really important to understand because again, the oligarchy is parasitic on the state, and in particular, those defense contracts need to come, and therefore the state needs to be rich enough to get, and the contracts for the AI bots to take over Social Security and Medicare and whatever also need to come privately, right? The state is being sort of enveloped in the private cloud. So it's not that they want to destroy the state, it's that it needs to be remade so that it is simply kind of a vehicle for enabling these purposes which drive toward transcending everything that is a bummer. And that's what I got. So.
No, thank you. And just to sort of make really explicit part of what you're saying about sort of re-engineering the genome and the like, I mean, there's a very serious strain of eugenics in the picture as well. So just that's clear to people.
Absolutely. Yes.
Henry, do you want to add anything to that or?
So, just to add, as Julie says, it is difficult to underestimate the weirdness of many of the ideas that are driving this agenda. So, a lot of it is, a lot of it is from a specific strain of libertarian science fiction of the 1980s and 1990s. Some of it comes from this even stranger body of work by people like Nick Land, this philosopher back in Warwick in the really in the early to mid 1990s, who starts talking about this so-called techno-capital singularity, in which markets and AI will sort of come together into this extraordinary post-human future, sort of which will devour us in a kind of a H.P. Lovecraft nightmare. Only this is going to be awesome. And if you look at, for example, Mark Andreessen's his techno-optimist manifesto, really what it is doing is it is taking this neo-reactionary line of thought and it is sort of turning this sort of delirious, strange sort of vision of we are going to be devoured by software and it is going to be awesome into a optimistic pap vision of the future in which sort of we expand out into the nearer galaxy. We learn how to sort of defeat the forces of death and everything becomes awesome forever. And so I think one of the things that really is interesting that came out in the last several weeks is that there are a lot of informal group chats that are happening between people in this space. And I kind of feel like this is one of those theories of the cosmos where really all of the action is being driven by things you can't see, by this dark matter, which is what creates the gravitational forces in which the conversations work in one way or another. And so I feel like there are a whole bunch of private, clandestine discussions in which people are really, I think, egging each other on into increasingly strange ideas that are increasingly disconnected from the actual realities of the country and of the world that we find ourselves in.
All right, so the questions in the Q&A and the questions that were submitted in advance are pretty consistent in their theme, namely, what can we do about it all? And so let me just start with one of them. Somebody has written, what do we need to do as a society to stop the rise of the tech oligarchy? Frankly, I don't want to live in a world where the rich and elite tell the rest of us how to live, what to buy, etc. What can social entrepreneurs do to make sure this doesn't happen? What kind of initiatives do we need to see to protect humanity? And I'll just add on to this, how far can we get with antitrust? Let's start there with a sort of very specific policy. approach, how we are seeing a lot of antitrust cases moving forward right now against some of the tech giants. They seem to be making progress. How far can antitrust take us?
So I'm going to say that one's for me because I'm the law person. So it can take us some places because it antitrust is a tool for taking aim at bigness under certain circumstances, right? So, and I don't want to underscore under certain circumstances, right? And antitrust law does not say bigness is always bad, but there can be circumstances in which it's been used in an anti-competitive way. But what I see when I look right now is Team Musk, Thiel, and Dreesen sitting pretty, right? We're definitely ganging up on Google in the US, right? They're the two different decrees, which is which is not great if you're Google, right? We see Apple coming to Google's defense. Uh, we see some beginnings of a ganging up on Facebook and Meta, right? And Zuckerberg has been very desperately and obviously and kind of pathetically, if it weren't so important for all of us, flailing around to curry favor with the administration. But in the EU, right? It's and here in the antitrust proceedings here, it's been a lot of Google, some Meta, a lot of Apple with the Apple Pay and the Apple Store, and not so much with the others. And the dark matter that Henry was just talking about, the chats, right? The those are other oligarchs, right? So if a thing about antitrust, right, is antitrust is an enforcement regime that allows a regulator to bring an enforcement lawsuit, and it's like one at a time, right? The one could be very, very big. In Europe, right, they have this legislative regime, the Digital Markets Act, that attempts to designate a bunch of large platforms as gatekeepers and subject them to certain requirements, but then you still have to go and enforce it. What we are, so we're kind of, it's kind of like taking aim at the very big thing that has emerged at the end, but not really going to the giant pools of dark wealth, or to the structure that enables this governance authority to be exercised. And I don't think we're really reckoning with the fact that there is a whole nother set of oligarchs that are just probably sitting there laughing, right? Now, the EU is, they're talking about a really big fine on Musk. And I always have to call out the nation, the sovereign nation of Brazil, which is the only nation on the planet that has ever gotten Musk, albeit temporarily, to behave in a way that he didn't want to. What did they do when he refused to take disinformation off of X? First, they banned all the ISPs from carrying X, and when he switched it over to Starlink, they froze all of Starlink's assets. In other words, they went straight for the money, and for a time being, it was effective, right? Antitrust is not personal, right? Antitrust is a judicial action that you bring against an identifiable sort of corporate entity. This is a different problem.
So just to add to that, there is this interesting European push, which is partly mounted a result of frustration with antitrust being incredibly slow and sort of effectively trying to do post hoc fixes to markets rather than ex ante structuring, and partly also a response to the speeches that JD Vance gave in Paris and in Munich, which scare the hell out of the Europeans. So there are a lot of people now who are talking about trying to create a so-called Euro stack of independent technologies from the ground up, platforms and similar, which would be European and which would be run in a decentralized way. And the idea, at least the theory is, we will see if this ever comes to anything in practice, is that this would be something which would provide for a genuine structural alternative. The problems with it are, A, the United States, if Europe tries to do this, The US is going to do everything it can to block this. B, even if it were to succeed, it's going to be extremely expensive. It is going to result in lower living standards and sort of jankier tech for a substantial period. But the fact that Europe is considering it really suggests that the debate there is changing in some significant ways, and people are trying, sort of they aren't getting to the dark pools of money that Julie is talking about, but they are trying to think about what are some of the infrastructural forms of power which could be exercised against Europe, and what are the ways in which they can build alternative structures which are better insulated.
Okay, thank you. Different direction. How far could a return to very significant inheritance taxes take us?
I guess if they die soon, could take us somewhere, but that's not the problem we have to address right now.
Well, in Ireland, they used to have
Sorry to be macabre, but you know.
In Ireland, they used to have penal laws which against Catholics, which required, for example, that Catholics, sort of when they died, their property would not be inherited by the eldest offspring, but scattered among a number of children. I do wonder if, in the longer run, given Elon Musk's quote legion unquote of offspring, if a work like that might actually sort of have some interesting consequences. That's not very serious, but
And another sort of tool that often comes up that feels not quite up to the job would be trying to actually crack campaign finance issues in the US. Any thoughts on whether we can, in fact, rein in the political use of money?
That could not hurt, right? It's an excellent idea. It turns out to be, though, very, very difficult to define what is a political use of money, right? And so here's a condensed version of my rant on the digital ad tech stack, right? When you push, to take a not so random example, right? And I'm going to take two, and they're both really inflammatory, right? So when you push Black Lives Matter content to one set of folks and Blue Lives Matter content to another set of folks, and you know who they are because they are profiled, and all you want is to get them riled up and angry, that does not count as political advertising within the space of the federal electioneering statutes, right? To be an electioneering communication, it needs to be identifiably for or against a particular candidate or issue. Same if you push, pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian content to other folks that you can identify. Same if you push, woke or anti-woke, all of these things that are hot button issues. And there is a gigantic, very, very granular apparatus for micro-targeting people based on their behavior and their preferences that is being weaponized by all sorts of people who are not trying to sell you sneakers and t-shirts now, just to get people into their corners, right? Just to get people absolutely convinced that the way you make America great again is you put a bajillion-dollar tariff on everything from everywhere, or you dismantle the universities, or you do, whatever, right? And it's like it wasn't the intent, right? But a device has been built for just jacking into everyone's id. And until you regulate that, it will not matter how much governance you put on political advertising and whether or not Citizens United goes. It just won't, right? That is the core problem that we have to deal with.
So talk to us about how that gets regulated. And I don't mean by that the politics of it, but I mean the sort of actual regulation that you have in mind there.
Ban behavioral advertising, ban behavioral data collection, ban training generative AI on garbage behavioral data, paid promotional content, automated content, just ban it all.
Great. Good. Thank you. Henry, you want to add anything there?
I don't have much to add on the solution, just on the space of what the problem is. Harry Hahn, one of my colleagues at Agora, and I are working on this idea about how it is that these micro-targeting techniques really make it impossible to have publics in the the John Dewey sense of the word. That is, we're in a world where if you want to win a campaign, as Harry argues, more or less it used to be that you used to have to try and build a coalition which had a lot of problems, but which also provided a certain kind of sense of shared solidarity, shared collective fate. And now we're in a world where really what you do is you increasingly do a bunch of very specifically targeted micro campaigns to try and assemble enough voters to get up to one above the whatever. And if this involves you targeting Jewish people to give them one message about sort of how the Democrats are letting Jewish people down, and Arab Americans to give them exactly the opposite message, and you get enough votes to do it, then you are basically home and free. So we are in a world in which the technologies really make it difficult to build the kinds of publics that you want. And instead, we get these very weird, somewhat deranged publics that you get on social media, partly just a result of the way that social media works, also partly sometimes a result of specific manipulation. The way in which Twitter X, for example, it has a large model called Grok 3. And over the last 24, 36 hours, if you ask Grok 3 random questions about any topic under the sun, it will start talking to you about South Africa, about the situations of Boers in South Africa, and how it is, sort of implicitly, that we ought to be looking to help out the Boers, help out the Afrikaners, and that they are being discriminated against. This is presumably a result of a instruction given by Elon Musk or somebody close to Elon Musk, which has gone wrong. But it does illustrate in a very stark way that we have these new forms of public, these new forms of technologies, which are really potentially shaping other people's perspectives as to the range of acceptable and plausible ideas out there, and trying to figure out how to actually resolve this problem. It's an incredibly difficult task.
So last question for now. So many people working on trying to get us through this time of transformation to a new version of free institutions, democracy, and pluralistic society are describing the challenge to be addressed as authoritarianism or fascism. And so the question is from here in the chat, but those concepts, authoritarianism and fascism, have typically involved political efforts that captured and controlled and strengthened the nation state more or less as we have known the nation state. Whereas the account that you've given of a global tech oligarchic movement seems to want to destroy many features of nation states. Are we mistaking what's happening if we analyze the threat we are facing as fascism and authoritarianism? In other words, should that vocabulary be put aside? And if so, does the kind of tech oligarchy vocabulary give us a slightly different way, or maybe not slightly, give us a different way of thinking about the problem that we should register the contrast in?
And
Oh, go ahead, Henry.
Yeah,
Please.
because this is something that, I think it's really worth reading the speech that J.D. Vance gave some weeks ago to the American Dynamism Conference, because really what this suggests is that this is a fundamental fissure that that you see among the pro-Trump people. So he talks about sort of how people claim that there is some kind of a tension between sort of social conservatives and Silicon Valley types, and he keeps on claiming during the speech, no, there isn't any tension. I swear there's no tension. I promise you absolutely no tension to see. So nothing to see here, go away. And of course, that suggests that yes, there is a big, absolutely enormous tension. So I think on the one side, you see a crowd of people who really are convinced that populism is a terrible idea. They don't like democracy, but they don't like democracy, they claim, because it sort of elects people like Donald Trump. So you see all of these sovereign individual type people, and sort of this is again one of the sort of books from the 1990s. And then on the other side, you see people who are really religious conservatives of one sort or another who want all of the modern stuff to go away. So it's a very, very weird coalition. On the one hand, of people who really want to rip down the nation state, who who want to in a certain sense, introduce the political arrangements of globalization into domestic politics. And on the other side, you see people who want globalization and all of the weird values and disruptions that go along with it to disappear entirely, and for us to return to 1950s, 1930s, 1860s, who the hell knows when, but a period when America could be America, and the two do not get on particularly well together. J.D. Vance is trying to sort of forge some kind of a compromise between them, but it is clearly tough going.
I am so glad you went first. I went through this paper with my platform governance seminar one day, and we did a giant Venn diagram on the whiteboard, right? Three circles. One is tech oligarchy, one is kind of Trump family enrichment, and one is sort of Project 2025 reinvention of the state in the sort of Christian nationalist image. The question in the chat, which is a great question, right, is sort of more generally about authoritarianism and fascism as sort of political movements to be understood in their essence. But it's, as Henry's comments suggest, it's super interesting to like do the Venn diagram exercise and understand, right, that there are places where either two or sometimes three of the circles overlap. Greenland, I shall pick, is illustrative. Greenland is a gather important if you care about polar trade and submarine routes. Greenland is also featured if you Google Peter Thiel and Praxis. It's been identified by the network state movement, which are these people who want to build corporate techno states like the thing in Severance, but for real. Greenland has been identified as like the ideal place to construct a corporate AI governed techno state. And then you again, this is where if I'm seeing the people in real life and I see their faces, they're giving me that look, right? But so if you ask, okay, what is Vance doing when he goes to Greenland, right? Peter Thiel's protege beats the hell out of me, right? There are these places where you kind of want to sing that old Aretha Franklin song, Who's Zooming Who, and kind of ask who's gonna, I think for the tech oligarchs, it's very instrumental, right? Because in their view, the nation state is an artifact. Whether it be a democratic nation state, which they definitely want no part of, all those institutions are artifacts, but a state with a strong leader who is not one of them probably also is an artifact because we're going to have the giant rotating space cylinders that are going to be governed as corporate techno states, and the rest is just kind of roadkill. I don't know if that speaks to your question, but I think that's kind of how they're sort of thinking about it.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. My hope in this conversation was that we would open up space for reflection. I think we've done that. The questions are extremely hard, so none of us are at the point yet of having answers. But I do think that a part of, if we think about all the questions in the chat and in the pre-submitted questions about what's to be done, it does seem like an important part of what's to be done is articulating an alternative vision for the future that we want, but also having a democratic way of coming to articulate that alternative vision. I think one of the challenges is you have tech oligarchs with considerable resources. Those resources empower them to do that visioning exercise because they know that they can leverage their resources to wield and affect great transformations. So in that regard, it is the case that big communities of people do also represent very significant resources just in their magnitude. And so reconnecting that basic democratic fact to visioning processes might be something useful for us in this moment. I say that very tentatively, right? As tentatively as all the rest of us have said things about our solutions, though I want to call out two of the proposals Julie made, the first about banning the use of behavioral data-based targeting, the micro-targeting and the like. You put it better than I just have reconstituted it, but we'll capture that in the recording. And then secondly, Julie, you also made the important point about Brazil and where the targeting that they undertook their effort to deal with the problem of X misinformation went to Musk's personal assets. It wasn't just about responding to the legal entity. That's a very important point and observation. So I think we have a few learnings from this that we can take forward to think about solutions, in addition to an incredibly rich and comprehensive set of analytical terms for understanding the circumstances we find ourselves in. So my great thanks to both of you, Henry and Julie. Really appreciate your gift of time.
Thank you so much for having us. It was lots of fun and educational.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Good pleasure. Good to see you both. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take good care.